Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It is my pleasure to guide you through session 3 of the Proposal Development Playbook, where we are tackling a tough but necessary topic, declinations. If you've spent any time in research administration, you know that receiving a no from a funder is not a sign of failure. It is a standard part of the process. Today, we are going to talk about how to turn those obstacles into opportunities. Our goal is to ensure you feel empowered to take the next steps, solicit feedback, and build a stronger proposal for the next cycle. On that note, let's begin. Okay, so how do we reframe rejection? The way we do it is through what I'm calling the resilience mindset. So the first thing we need to do is to change how we think about a declined proposal. Successful grantsmanship is never about chasing money for a single one-off project. It is about building a long-term strategy. Experienced researchers will tell you that you need to live by a specific mantra, and it goes something like this that many of you are familiar with, but if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. Now, why do you try again, right? I think not only in terms of being someone who is uh, resilient in terms of their ability to see a goal and to see it through, even if at the first instance you don't have the kind of success that you had envisioned. That's just a good mantra to live by. But here we have the advantage of understanding that this is actually an evidence-based mindset. What do I mean by that? So the first grant proposal is often the academic equivalent of sort of a starter home, right? It involves a massive amount of work, has a few structural leaks, and primarily exists so you can learn how to build a better one next time. So that being said, what you might call a kind of sophomore surge, if you will, in grant funding is a well-documented phenomenon. So here's some evidence to break down of why faculty PIs tend to find more success after their initial attempt. So let's take actually a funder that we're not focusing so much on today, but has a good basis of evidence for this phenomenon. The first submission, when you submit to the NIH, think of it as A0, right? And the first submission is an A1. So data consistently show that A1 applications have significantly higher success rates. What do I mean by that? So a resubmission allows the PI to address specific critiques from the summary statement. Instead of guessing what the reviewers want, you have a literal checklist of their concerns. And what's sort of the change that you can expect from the first submission to perhaps the second submission? So again, NIH data tells us that whereas original applications might have a success rate of say 10 to 15%, resubmissions often jump to somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% because not only of an improved fit for the funder, but also for its feasibility in terms of the second submission. And that's directly related to the fact that you're receiving reviewers' feedback and you're making modifications therein. And so really it's important to think about these areas when it comes to grantsmanship, not only for federal opportunities, but also for any other kind of funder. The second time can really have an important outcome if you just realize that the first or sometimes the second go around may not go exactly as you like, but you have to view it as a long-term process or long-term strategy, as we mentioned here. So again, I repeat, if at first you don't succeed, it's always good to try and try again. We also need to recognize that every submission, even the ones that don't get funded, they build your team's research competence and your institution's administrative readiness. This preparation is what allows you to hit the ground running when the next deadline rolls around. Finally, remember that while publication is about science, grant writing is fundamentally about persuasion or marketing your ideas to a specific audience. So a rejection often just means that you need to refine that pitch to better fit the funder's agenda or the funder's scope, right? So again, think of it as a process not of rejection, but a revision ultimately. So let's talk about the program officer. When a proposal is declined, your most valuable asset in the federal system is the program officer. Um, sometimes they have a different name, a program director or a lead or something to that effect, but oftentimes we see the term program officer. These individuals administer the grant programs and have significant influence over funding decisions. I can't emphasize this enough. You must make a human connection. Move beyond just being a proposal number by scheduling agency visits or phone calls to differentiate yourself from the competition. So let's emphasize that for a moment. It's okay. Not only is it okay, it is encouraged to reach out to program officers because not only are they the people that are administering the program that you hope to receive extramural funding from, but also they are a public-facing position in their own right. And so they have, by their own accounts, a responsibility to help entities, institutions, potential PIs to both refine and enhance their current submissions, but also their future ones, and to help in the overall process of improving your grantsmanship. They can be a really important tool for you. So don't be shy about reaching out to them. Now, the way in which you can do that depends on the institution, right? So if I'm going back to my original assumption, which is that many of you come from an institution that perhaps hasn't had as a robust an office of sponsored programs in the past or a similar suite of staff members, it's okay for you as a potential PI to reach out and to ask for some of this feedback, both before you submit and just as crucially after you submit and receive either hopefully an award, but in this case, a declination. It's okay to reach out and to make this connection. It's not as some faculty that I've worked with in the past, they don't POs don't view this as a kind of imposition. It's really an opportunity for education. So take advantage of that opportunity. So what I want you to think about is to think about how you're going to use these kinds of follow-up interactions to educate the program officer on the unique significance of your project and its potential impact on national needs, right? So one thing I like to mention to faculty members as we go through the process from the conception of an idea to the submission of a proposal is to think about how the mission of your specific research program, as you see it, both in your mind and as you write it in a technical narrative, must match the mission and the scope of the funder. So the federal government is really many entities under one very large umbrella. And when you include, for example, the various arms of the military, but also the executive cabinet agencies, independent agencies, for example, like NSF, it can be construed as the largest organization of any kind in the world. So you're going to have more than one mission that's listed within the pages of, let's say, grants.gov. I say pages in a metaphorical sense, but you take my point there. And I think the goal here is to recognize that a good proposal isn't just having the right language written down in a way that's both coherent and understandable, although you should be trying to focus on those things. What really moves you from having a proposal that is good to successful is making sure that the PO sees you and your institution as a necessary extension of their own mission, right? So when you reach out to the PO after a declination, for example, again, when we come back to the idea of a long-term strategy, that's one of the things that you want to think about is that it's an opportunity not only for the PO to understand who you are and what you're all about, but also to educate them on why you are uniquely suited for this role. Of whatever the program that is that you're applying to. So really think about those things as you receive a declination. Again, a declination, it's a temporary judgment, and you're in it for the long haul. So just remember those things and take heart in that fact. But most importantly, uh, it's important to use this process to stay relevant. And you can do this by checking in by email or phone, just to engage with the agency's evolving priorities. And again, I repeat, but just to emphasize, don't be shy. Specifically ask for the review committee's written feedback and evaluations if it wasn't forthcoming in the original declination notice, so you can understand the why behind the decision. And understanding the why behind the decision will help you and be a kind of set of pieces of feedback, if you will, for your second, third, or fourth draft of the proposal that you hope to submit on a subsequent timeline. So again, understanding the why can help you improve your ask in the future. All right, so let's deconstruct a little bit what it means when a funder says no. And I think the best way to do this is to dive deeply into what is the set of feedback that the funder is giving you. So here, once you have that feedback in hand, it's time to take a look at it objectively, right? So understand that reviewers are human. They often have to read many proposals in a very short time. They frequently form an opinion, oftentimes on the first page. In psychology, they refer to this as the primacy effect, right? That is to say, when you read a lot of pieces of information, you kind of tend to remember the first thing that's available to you. And so it's worth reflecting on that fact that oftentimes the funder, the reviewer, they're looking at some of the first things that you put out there. And it's just worthy of reflecting on that as a kind of reality, a human reality, if you will. But they frequently form an opinion on the first page and spend the rest of the time looking for reasons to validate that decision. So in many cases, rejection stems from avoidable technical hiccups rather than a lack of good science, right? So this common feedback might include complexity issues where overly complex sentences or technical jargon has confused the reviewer. And again, it's not that the reviewer isn't scientifically literate or even expert in the decision in the science that you're discussing, but you want to think about how, in this case, not that brevity breeds clarity, but um, uh, to focus on things not being quite so complex is really a good rule of thumb in proposal writing, generally speaking. But again, the idea is that you want to make it uh, as plain as possible for the reviewer to understand what it is, not only the science that you're doing, but just as crucially, I'm quick to advise faculty members, make sure you're thinking about how you are coming across in terms of this as an end-to-end project. For example, are you specifying not only how you're leading the project, but who is going to work with you on this project? What students, be it graduate or undergraduate students, are working with you on this project? Do you have contractors that you're working with? In other words, do you have a sense of who your team is and how you plan to deploy them for the various responsibilities that come with a project period of performance, as we call it? But again, it may be the case that, again, the science that you're looking to do, there's no issue there. It's just that the funder may not necessarily understand how you plan to achieve the outcomes that you're stating in your technical narrative. So another major red flag outside of issues of complexity, as I outline above, is coherence problems. So there may be a disconnect between your abstract, your problem statement, and the budget. So that's another thing is to think in terms of consistency of presentation. So one thing, it may sound that it's both easy to understand but hard to forget, but it turns out that when you're starting out and writing a grant and you're including all of the attendant uh, um, required documents in addition to the technical written portion of the narrative. You want to make sure that those items are aligning. So for example, if you're proposing something in the budget, you want to make sure that it's addressed appropriately in the narrative. Uh, and I think a good way of thinking about this is, for me, I always try to advise my faculty members, and I offer it here to you today, to think of a budget, or rather to think of your process as a budget first process, right? Because you can avoid some of these coherence problems, as we're calling them, with making sure that what you plan to purchase with the grant is fairly, if not ironclad, is pretty well set and solid in terms of your thinking, so that when you go in to give the more nuanced view of the written narrative and to provide language to your ideas that are written in financial terms in the budget, that those are aligning, that you have these two documents that one influences and informs the other, and that you're not, for example, proposing something in your budget or budget justification that is in no way reflected in the narrative. So that's something that when you review a persuasive document like this, remember that you don't want to propose something and it kind of feels out of left field, let's say. And so the way you kind of deal with that kind of coherence problem is to have people who are not only expert in your field reviewing this, but you can also have, and you come back to your research administration hub, however it's constructed, that they can help you to think through these issues and to make sure that one document is in effect speaking to another, quote unquote. So finally, it's a good question to ask yourself is, did you follow the instructions? Now, this seems fairly straightforward, and I don't mean to ask that question as a way to be rude, far from it. Rather, it turns out that, and it has something to do with how people compose long form written narratives. But it's been my experience that when you begin writing a proposal, you are so focused on trying to put pen to paper and to get your ideas out there that sometimes in the process of putting together a written piece, you may forget or haven't looked over sufficiently what are the criteria that the funder is asking you to write. And I think that's something where it's always worth, one of the first three things you sort of do in grantsmanship, at least in my experience, and there's lots of ways to approach this problem, but the first is to think about your eligibility as both an individual and an institution. Can you actually apply to this opportunity? Second, you also want to think about the budget, as I mentioned, so before you write the narrative, think about the budget. But then third and finally, of all the prompts and the questions and the instructions in whether it's the RFP or the NOFO or some other instrument that is asking for proposals, you want to think about what are their instructions. And I think that's where circling with your team and think of your team broadly speaking, not only cross-departmentally in the case of working with an Office of Sponsor Programs, but also thinking, cross-institutionally, like finding, this is an area where if you have a question about the instructions, you can certainly reach out to the program officer, of course, well in advance of the deadline. But again, they're there to help make sure that you're submitting your best work. And remember, the funder wants to receive a good set of proposals that they can draw from. And so it's in their best interest to have an application that's really well suited to the demands of the program that they're looking to fund. So again, did you follow the instructions? Not addressing specific criteria or missing required non-narrative documents like biosketches or equipment descriptions can lead to a rejection without a full review. So try to think about it in those terms as well. And finally, for this slide, remember that federal agencies, they're required by policy to provide notifications to unsuccessful applicants regarding the time, form, and content of the review decision. So again, they are bound to give you some kind of feedback. Some funders are more fulsome than others in terms of their feedback. But again, you have a right to at least ask and see where you could have improved and where you can improve next time. Okay, let's think about our final slide, at least for this section, or for this session of the Proposal Development Playbook. So what are some constructive next steps when you resubmit? Some tangible next steps, I think, are first, analyze the merit review. This is a theme we've mentioned during this presentation. But analyze the merit review standards outlined in your original NOFO or Notice of Funding Opportunity to see exactly how your project was measured against the competition, right? So this can come in the form of how much money was allocated to this specific offering, how many applications did they receive, how many awards do they typically give? Is this less than perhaps it was in prior years? These are questions that are really helpful to understanding why you had a specific outcome and why it may have been, perhaps, but basically why it didn't go in the way that you had hoped, right? So it's worth checking in on with the program officer, but also with other staff associated with this grant opportunity. What do the standards outlined in the NOFO tell you? Next, look deeply and perform what some people refer to as a SMART objective audit. SMART refers to specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-sensitive goals, right? So reviewers often flag these kinds of goals that are often too broad or they lack administrative planning. So again, the SMART framework is a really helpful one that applies in many areas of professional life. But in the case of grants, I think it's worth reflecting on. A grant is in effect of a kind of, let's call it a forecast. It's an opportunity to say, I would love to literally propose doing this research that not only I feel meets my own needs as a researcher, but more importantly, in this instance, is fulfilling the goals of the funder. And to the extent that you can codify the goals that you have as being shared with that of the funder, and you further frame those goals as being in the SMART category, which is to say that you can actually achieve them. It's worth reflecting on those. And oftentimes when you give a hard look at your previous writing, you can start to see under that analysis where you can make your goals a bit more achievable, a bit more clear, and a bit more time bound, right? All the elements of the SMART framework. So in addition, you must also perform a team and timeline evaluation. So you want to answer some of these following questions, right? Can your team commit to the revised timeline or timetable? Do you need to gather preliminary data or research points to answer specific reviewer concerns, right? So this is an area where, just as we mentioned with the SMART analysis, focusing on an evaluation of your timeline and the construction of your team. Perhaps you need to make some modifications on a future submission to make it more persuasive, but also more compelling as an overall ask. And some of those points will be written there plainly from the reviewers' feedback. And so, again, this is another way of thinking about how you can improve on a subsequent submission. And lastly, you'll want to consult your support team at the Office of Sponsored Programs or whatever the hub of your research administration staff is located. Remember that they serve as your liaison for legal and administrative matters, and they can help you navigate this institutional review approval process for your resubmission, right? So, in other words, this staff can help you. They often have great editorial competency. People who have both written and submitted grants before have served as lead writers on grants of a variety of cases. That's certainly the case for myself in terms of the proposals that I prepared and submitted in the past. But they also provide that kind of legal understanding as well as administrative understanding. You'll often have folks, as I mentioned in a previous session, who are certified in different professional bodies that can help to understand things like, for example, federal uniform guidance and those other areas that may uh, um, help to improve your ability to submit in the future. So again, never forget that the OSP staff is there to help you, but remember that they can help you not just submit what you need to submit and review what needs to be reviewed in terms of compliance, but they can also improve your writing and use them as a resource, as they often have wonderful tools at their disposal. So that being said, I want to thank you for joining me for session 3. Moving forward in our 4th session, we'll talk about perhaps the happier side of the process, what to do when you actually receive that award notice. See you then.